how do people? What does it do to the local community then?
The local communities we would know, and they would be the poor communities, because we wouldn't know the Novoruskis, as they call them, the New Russians, and they wouldn't be a church. So the local people were extremely poor when we went there. The money collapsed. Technically, in Russia, they used to say the ruble was equal to the dollar. But in my time, first time I was there, you would get 2,800 rubles for a dollar, and 2 years later you get 5,800. And then they took the 3 noughts off the notes and said, instead of 5,000 rubles, you have 5. And then it began to, the collapse of the money was so serious and so total at that stage that paper probably was more valuable than the denomination.
So what did people do?
We don't know how to survive. We would have done a lot of help, humanitarian help, in medicine, sometimes local medical services, and sometimes in education, and quite often feeding people as well. We'd have.
Would you have experienced the, say, communism's, the end of communism into imperialism, really? I mean, did you see that happen?
I think the collapse was coming in this, and notable in some people, because they would tell you the fear has gone. I would have known people who would tell me about the fear they had of family being taken next door at night, or from their dome or their block of flats, and they were afraid to look out the window, because if they were seen looking out, they probably would disappear the next day. Or the fear of threats of one kind or another. I knew a young man who told me about his father, a doctor. They came to him and said, we want you to sign these documents for one of your patients, saying he was mad. And the doctor said, but he's not mad, there's nothing wrong with the man. Well, they said, if you don't sign them today for him, they'll be signed for you tomorrow. And he said, my father signed, but never recovered.
Was that unsettling?
Of course it's unsettling, because it's personalised. I knew all that from my history, and a lot more.
But you were now experiencing it.
But it's very unsettling when it becomes personal.
Yeah.
You know? Or, for example, people I would meet who were in the Ukraine during the induced famines in the 30s, when millions died, people who would talk about walking long distances with just in deep pain of hunger.
Yeah. So living amongst, with these people that had these awful memories that they were bringing with them, but also, were they still, when you were newly into that new parish, were you dealing with people who were still trying to recover?
The people needed to recover, but there was very little consciousness of either the possibility or the desire, because they lived in a system that had to be where they had to keep quiet, and as a result, they often buried their hurts and wouldn't even bring them to consciousness. And I would have moments talking to people where I might have said to people, for example, even teaching about the Christian faith and talking about the Calvary experience of Jesus, and ask, well, look, has there ever been a Calvary experience in your life? Where people stop, and maybe after a bit of invitation might say, yes, I remember that time, marching on the way to prison, or one way or another, or family members disappearing, or my father was taken away by the government and never came back. And even now at this moment, there is a lot of pressure that people don't talk about things now. I think Putin was considering a law last year, I think, to make it a crime nearly to say that these things happened.
Were people conditioned then?
People were very conditioned to be careful. And some were very conditioned to report on you. And people, as it was part of the life in Soviet times, there's a kind of story of a Soviet boy who went in and told the police that his parents said prayers and they were up in trouble, and he was made a hero of the nation. that kind of abuse of child and family, that people would know that. And reporting. People were still reporting when I was there, as they would have been told to do in Soviet times. You know, poor reporting anything unusual they saw around.
Oh, yeah. And so people were broken, were they?
People were very broken, and we would see in our ministry, and Stephen may have mentioned this, we would see in our ministry that working for a kind of healing of the conscience, but mostly of the consciousness, would be an important dimension of gospel liberation.
Okay, so you were not just dealing with with what you saw. You had to get deep inside their subconscious.
Yes, and our Christian faith, I believe, has great ways of dealing with that. For example, our sacrament of reconciliation and forgiveness is one factor that people can find themselves in very deep wounds. For example, there's a very big tradition of family planning by means of abortion, that people just didn't think of anything wrong about it until they came to a Christian consciousness, and all of a sudden it's a massive trauma for them. And as a result, being able to deal with that. But there's also we need forgiveness for things we consciously do wrong. We need healing for what is done to us. Most people are much more sinned against than sinning. And for that, they don't need forgiveness. They need healing.
Well, did any of this rub off on you in those years? Were you affected yourself?
Well, at one level, I think in ministry, everything rubs off on you, because if you have a heart for people. But the other side is you have to also to learn to be able to empathise and be with people, that it doesn't serve them to duplicate their experience.
Your role were you parish priest there?
We were all parish priests, but when we got a new bishop, he asked me, as being the only old man around, to become his vicar general. So I spent the last 4 years before coming home working with him to re-establish the church, because the church disappeared. There was 60 years with no church in Russia, and here we are now, people coming out of the woodwork, and for example, marvellous experiences. A woman came to me one day, she said, my mother's a Catholic. She says, I'm not a Catholic, I'm nothing now. She says, but my mother's a Catholic, and she heard there's a priest around, would you mind visiting her? And I went to see her, and she said, I want to go to confession. It's 75 years since my last confession.
Okay, so I did this.
And many times, 60 years. Or people, another experience that I found continually, people waiting to meet a priest, waiting to die until they saw a priest. You know, and often have the sacraments and they're at peace. Maybe die in a day or a week. They are literally hanging on there until it was an extraordinary time of grace in that sense.
Happy to see a priest.
Ready to want to go to the sacraments. They haven't had them for 60 years. Yeah. And now, when they have them, said now like a bit like Simeon in the Gospel, now it's time to dismiss my Lord.
You must tell me in those years, did you, there was a bombing, there was a lot of turbulence, wartime.
Yes, we were there just after as the first war in Chechnya was ending, 96, thereabout, 7. And it was a very militarised zone. It was really like parts where I had some few parishioners I would visit around the town of Mozdok. And that was particularly so because that was the centre of Russian activity into the war in Chechnya. And there would be great quizzing there. I remember one day coming in there, and the soldier told me to put my car aside and come into the office. But when he saw I handed him my passport, my God, he said, what on hell is an Irishman doing in Mozdok? You know, quite humorous, but then he apologised, which is very rare, and he said, now we have to ask you a lot of questions, but really they're for your safety. You know the situation here. And that didn't often happen, but it did on that occasion.
Yeah, so in fact, You were respected, so you seem to have fitted in the community there very well.
There is a sense, yes, I would. I think we all fitted in at a certain level. We're always foreigners. We have to get our documents and spend a lot of time on them, money too. But we were dealing with people who probably weren't a big threat to anyone. We were dealing with a poor end of society. Often there were Catholics who had been impoverished by the war and by the things that happened in Stalin's time and afterwards. Many of them had been in Siberia, or many of them had been in Kazakhstan, and crept back in Khrushchev's time to work on a collective farm or get a garden and support themselves on that.
All right. Kind of working quietly.
Working quietly, and yes.
There was a time, I would imagine, that you were anxious to get home. The logistics of getting home and back again, were they easy?
They were, and there were very interesting things we noticed. When you're working in a situation like this, you get on with it. And then when you reflect back on it, things are quite a bit different. Like we work away, and I would have been called a number of times by the Irish embassy and told to go home. As I said, it's too dangerous to be there. But we knew where we were working better than they did, and they probably didn't want to be dealing with a kidnap case either. But anyway, the embassy was good to us as well in other ways. But they would estimate that where we were working, we shouldn't have Irish people. And so that, on the other hand, when you're in a scene, you work away, and you probably put up with a fair bit as well, and but you have to get on with it. I think all mission work is that way.
Your role as a Vicar General for 4 years, you were overseeing everything, were you?
Well, yes, and sometimes the bishop would be out of the country trying to get money to help us along, and I would, yes, well, we organise things in parishes, so in that sense, the parishes they run away, they run along. But there are things coming back in one way, sometimes on the government's end of things, about documentation that applies to all. Sometimes we're trying to start a parish and they may not have enough to keep the priests going. And sometimes the issues, especially at that stage, there were big issues around training catechists, trying to get people trained to train people to promote the faith.
Were you working with catechists there?
We set up a course for the diocese to train catechists, and I would have a catechetical background myself, but I wasn't doing much of it. I do a few units, but we would have different people we were able to call on who would do units. We'd get lay people together, sometimes scores of them, and do courses where they would do in modules. So we would do different modules and be able to go back then and work in their parishes and work from there, maybe come back for next year again for a number of modules, and eventually reach up to the position of a diploma in catechetics and that kind of thing.
You just mentioned that the bishop was out looking for money. Were you not self-sufficient there?
No. No.
Were you getting government help, or did you?
We got never get anything from government. We never get. The people are not able to pay. They will make some contribution, but you are talking about pen money, really. Generally, now there may be times when some parishes may develop a bit better, but the reality is, we are the mission there is supported from home. That's why Irish people have been incredibly generous to us, and we wouldn't be saying that out loud, but because you have to have respect for the people who are benefiting from such help. But we do say it and recognise, and are very happy to recognise that our whole mission in Russia really had to be supported from outside. Big way we were helped very much from Ireland. Germany was a massive help. Vatican and some income as well.
Oh, yes, indeed. And so money was coming from the Vatican, yeah?
Some money came to the diocese, not direct to our own mission, our Irish mission, but would come to the diocese, as it does to a lot of missions around the world. When people do Peter's Pence and other collections for the Vatican, a lot of it is distributed around to needy areas in the world. People don't often know that, but I would know that myself. I'd have collected money myself at times in the nuncio in Moscow to bring to different missions.
Yeah. What do you think you did and the rest of your congregation to make a difference?
It is very hard to estimate because recently there was a conference in Moscow of the heads of all the religious orders who are working in Russia. And they came to saying at the moment, we don't see much fruit for 15 years' work. And that is very hard on the people working there. There seemed to be a great flourish first, and then you got down to the hard grind of being able to educate and form and grow. And that is much harder than initial enthusiasm. Coming out of the communists, people felt they were breaking out of something. And I certainly knew from early on that we were only just beginning, that this kind of evangelization is a long-term thing and probably generations for anything in a big way. But it is there, and a lot of people have got a great start for themselves in their faith. But it is at initial stage and it's hard work. What we did, certainly the areas in which we've been working, we have two areas in particular. One is now looked after by a group of priests and nuns from France. And the area where Con and where three of our men are working at the moment is extremely complicated, politically, socially, historically. It's the Cossack territory, which would be a bit like Orange Man Russians at times, and it can complicate things in terms of who's pulling the strings at the office where you want to get a planning permission or a visa. And often you don't know. And there is an immense skill in many bureaucrats about pushing paper and doing nothing, like most places in the world. So that is all there, and that is discouraging. But I think that there are also disappointments that very few vocations have come, and the situation is not improving at the moment. There are a few Russian sisters coming through, a few priests too, but haven't got anyone to date. And the hope is they will come, but very often you get that in a second generation rather than first in mission work.
Do you think that there was a rekindling after, in your time, a revival of it?
There is a revival in many ways, and I think in some ways in the Orthodox Church now it is picking up well. In our Catholic Church there is certainly a revival because the Catholic Church was simply eliminated by 1939. Every single church in Russia, every single priest was gone, killed or exiled or just disappeared. Every work was suppressed. And then you're starting 69 years later, and my estimation is that 6 out of every 7 Catholics had disappeared in that time. So you're dealing really with a remnant of a small number of Catholics, and they're only finding their courage and finding their faith, and it's going to take time. And they have also gone through all the chaos of being without education, and sometimes very poor, and sometimes in marriages now or connections that are complicating as well. And so it's a very complex world to start building. You can imagine reading the New Testament, finding in Rome, where you have a group maybe in Corinth of 30 Catholics among 500,000. And we read the account about them now and we can think almost it's all Corinth here. But the reality is they were all able to fit in 2 houses. Now in many places we would have a house, have Eucharist in a family house first, and maybe sometimes spilling out over the yard. Eventually we've got to try to get some building that would be able to be a bit more helpful. But the level of our work was very small, and we would be also trying to see that we're trying to build communities more than buildings, even though we sometimes need the building to house them.
It's kind of hard to imagine how that I mean, it's amazing what you've done, but it's hard to imagine a country that would be so opposed to religion, and in such a short time to have it come back again.
Yes, but Stalin in 1939 set up a group to examine how far religion had died out by then. And they found in their studies that something in the region of 53% were still believers. I think he sent the people who did the inquiry to Siberia. But there are levels at which faith continues. People would have put their icons up in the attic because they were afraid they would have been trouble if they were seen. And they may be living the faith within their heart. Many did that. And some people suppressed the faith so deeply that sometimes it now just came forth. I was called to a doctor not very long before I came home. Her daughter had become a Catholic in Moscow. And she asked me to see this woman, and I chatted with her, and she was ill with cancer. And eventually I chatted a bit about, she asked me a bit about the faith, and I explained a bit, and eventually baptised her and anointed her and gave her communion all for the first time. And then she started saying, "Tak хорошо, tak хорошо." This is great. This is all my life I've been waiting for this moment.
That's very touching, isn't it? Mm.
Over and over again, I'd have experienced it, that something was stirred. And it is slow and it's going to be long term. But it was a bit like we had in this country in penal times. In this whole diocese of Waterford, there was a time.
Yeah.
There were 3 priests.
But, sorry, yes,
You're fine.
But so I can see your extreme passion and your for your mission.
My blessing, I would say.
Yeah. Did you learn yourself from your experience?
Almost. This was an experience. It was, when I look back to now, it was tough going in many ways, and I troubled my health a bit. But it was a blessing. My life would be impoverished in a lot of ways without it. If I wasn't there, maybe something else would be going well. Yeah. But it was kind of experience that I just would not like to be without in my life.
Would you do it all over again?
I would, yes.
Would you?
I would, yes.
Without even thinking?
I wouldn't. The only thing that would stop me even now is my health.
Really?
Yes.
When did you come home?
I'm home, I can hardly believe it, I'm home 8 years.
I'm
home. I'm sure I should have forgotten about it now, but I still dream.
No, I'd say you probably dream in Russian. But your time here at home then for the last 8 years, what have you been doing?
I came back home and I had some medical things for a while, but I was putting our house in Galway, and we have a small centre there, a kind of retreat centre, a non-residential retreat centre, and we do courses in adult education and faith and scripture work and personal dialogue with people, different things. Yeah. Basically, to be a support for the church and to help them, trying to work with the local church, like I was doing here too for a long time.
Yes, because when you think about it, you were, you were well into your
old age,
your middle age, we'll call it, before you even thought about going out, or before you did go to Russia. But then, kind of that experience in your life must have really.
It was great. When I was provincial, I was in all our missions. I spent a good bit of time in South Africa in the worst years of apartheid. They're supporting our men there, and that time I got to New Guinea. We had men working there at the time. And South America, I have a brother there, as a missionary in South America.
Oh, did you?
Yes, did you interview anyone from Venezuela? You did.
With
John
did,
McCarthy.
Of course, yeah, John.
He was there, Vincent, and he was there from the beginning of that mission.
Yeah. Genie, so your family have a lot to. You've certainly left your mark in these places, but have you? Do you feel sorry now about the way things are happening here at home? And when you look,
it is just tragic. There's no other word. It's so terrible that the things happen. It is equally terrible how they were managed or mismanaged. Human beings will sin. It's no defence about anything, but we scapegoat also. We are dealing really with 2.5% of abuse in this country, and no word about the 97%. And that is sad for people, because like we meet them in their ministry, people who are in abuse situations, and not about the clergy, but need a lot more concerted support and help in their situation, and the courage to face them at times. But in terms of the clerical scandals and the clerical abuse particularly, because that is an exceptional tragedy for anyone. But in gospel terms, it's just so much worse.
Was there? Yes, it is. Was there? Did you witness any abuse abroad in Russia?
There is abuse everywhere. There is abuse everywhere. That is because there are human beings everywhere.
Yeah.
And people.
But in
Russia,
in the church now?
I didn't actually.
Yeah.
No, I didn't, thank God.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if there was, that it would be picked up quickly. It may, I don't know. But I know for sure I didn't abuse. I didn't.
Yeah.
I saw other abuse of tragedies happening and priests beaten, and one of my priest friends was poisoned. And
How do
things
you mean
like
poisoned?
he was trying to help somebody, and one morning she put poison in his tea. He was having a cup of tea, and she made the tea, and he was helping us, but she was a stranger in a town.
Yeah.
It looks possibly that she was a serial killer who had come to the town, but she was later convicted for it. But he, a 40-year-old priest, a Polish priest, went with the body to Poland for the funeral. It was only when I come back that we got the full analysis of what had happened. But you get awful tragedies. Great friends were killed there in accidents and snow roads and ice roads and that kind of thing. And priests. So there's always a heavy casualty loss in missionary work. Most years there are.
Did you lose some close friends yourself, or?
Yes, accidents. Have a lot of accidents. I wouldn't know. I knew this man. In fact, he had been visiting me 2 days before he was poisoned, and I would have known. And there was another fine young, great youth working priest from Poland. He was killed in a car accident. We had another Franciscan killed in Moscow in a car accident. We had people, particularly a few Indonesian priests, beaten up a bit and they had to go home. You know, being in my position in the diocese as well, I'd have been acquainted with what was going on around about the diocese. On the other hand, most were allowed to. You get down, you walk along, often walking at low key, but maybe all the better for that.
Right, and finally, where you're back here again. So, just talk to me about the whole structure of the church. Do you believe in this hierarchy, or do you see the church differently?
Well, God doesn't need a hierarchy. God doesn't need churches, but we do. And as long as there are human beings around, we need structures. The problem is that we make a structure and then it becomes obsolescent. It's out of date. And then, especially if we put a sacred canopy over it or put a kind of nimbus over it, then we think somehow that this has to stay this way and it's sacred. But structures are meant to serve values, not the other way around. The Sabbath is for the people, not the people for the Sabbath. And in that sense, we need to be all the time renewing structures and asking them, are they doing what they're meant to do? Yeah. If they're not, we have to say, what will do what we're meant to do? Right. Are they good news for people or are they oppression?
Father Michael Screene, there's been an incredible story and I appreciate very much talking to you here.
I didn't know you were talking to Stephen, or I wouldn't have said anything, but I'm glad to meet you.